Today we are talking about something foundational to your sales efforts. If you don't get this locked in, you're going to spend your time flailing around looking for prospects here, there, and everywhere and signing a bunch of prospects that you have no business supporting. Today we're talking about your target client profile. Your target client profile, or TCP, is vital to your sales and marketing and prospecting efforts, because if you don't lock it in, it's really hard to find clients that you can support effectively. Your role as a managed service provider is to be as efficient as possible. Establishing a solid target client profile is core for the efficiency of your service team. If you don't set this and honor it on a regular basis, it's really hard for your service team to be efficient. It's not just efficiency of your service team, but it's efficiency of your sales efforts as well. If you spend all your time going to every conference of every different vertical out there and trying to close every piece of new business you possibly can, you spend a lot of time chasing bad leads around as well. So it's important that you use your target client profile to make you as efficient as you possibly can. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about verticalization and some ideas around picking verticals that will help your business as well. Back when I was a service manager, I had a pretty good relationship with my sales team, but on occasion they would bring forward some not great fit prospects, and I would routinely try to push them back and say, hey, look, I don't think this is a great fit for us. And the conversation usually would go like this: hey, Adam, I think we have a really great prospect. They maybe don't quite fit our model just perfectly, but let me tell you about them. And they would tell me about whatever the situation was, and often I would say, I don't know, guys, this probably isn't the best fit. And I probably won half of those arguments and they won the other half. And the ones that weren't a great fit, some of them went fine, but some of them didn't go real well. And it was all to do with the fact that they just didn't fit what we were trying to do. And it was just harder for us to support them. So know that it's a really important piece to get dialed in. And it's this thing we talk about in the peer groups all the time around, I'm trying to, close more deals, find more clients and those kinds of things. And we say, hey, do you have your target client profile figured out? And they go, well, kinda. And I said, well, okay, time out. Let's go get this figured out, because if you don't get it figured out, it's going to be really hard to continually close new deals, especially new deals that are good for you and good for the client, because ultimately you want both sides to feel comfortable and to be happy about the relationship. What criteria should you use to determine your target client profile? And a lot of times people just kind of lean into two things, right? They say, I want to have X to Y number of users and they need to be in this geographic location. And while those two things are important, they're not the only criteria. So let's talk about 5 or 6 different criteria that I think are important for you. First one is of course size, company size, and that could be a number of users, number of workstations, willingness to spend X number of dollars, right? Maybe you have a minimum spend versus a minimum number of users. That's totally fine. But the idea here is that you have a sort of a minimum. When I talk to MSPs about what the size criteria is for their target client profile, is anything from 15 to 50 or 25 to 50 or 50 to 150 or something like that, where there's this really broad swing. And my suggestion is that you want that to be as tight as possible. 5 to 10 machines or 5 to 10 user swing is about where I think you should be. You don't want to take on everybody, right? You don't want to say, that 50 to 150, for example, there's quite a big difference in company size, company maturity, and stuff that kind of fits in that range. And so when you're thinking about target, I'm thinking about that target on the bullseye, right? That very small target, right? That very small piece, I think is important to be aiming at, because when you take on anybody and everybody, it's pretty tough to call that a target, right? That might be more of what you might consider your acceptable client profile, and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. The second criteria is budget, right? Do they have an IT budget? Is the budget big enough for them to support their organization? A lot of times people won't have much of a budget, or they won't understand how much they're spending or those kinds of things, because that's just a fairly normal thing. You should have an idea about the type of client you're looking to work with, right? Sometimes you're good with, hey, they don't have a budget, let's just help them set one. Or, hey, we really prefer that they have one figured out. And sometimes company size plays into this too, and really more about company revenue generation. So if you think about a company that's generating a lot of revenue per end user, their budget's likely to be a little bit higher than a company that is making a lot less money per user, per employee, right? So just think about that a little bit when you think about budget. Criteria number 3 is all about location. Now, I know a lot of MSPs talk about that they can support anybody as long as they have an internet connection and a laptop, right? And that's fine, and you very, very likely can. But the goal for the location aspect of your target client profile is all about knowing where you do the best work. It often works the best if you can get to their location pretty easily, right? So if you have to hop on a plane or drive for 2 or 3 hours just to get to their site every time you need to be on site, that's not terribly efficient. Now, if you never need to go on site or it's once a year and it's a thing you're just going to do, okay, maybe you're willing to do that, but that's probably not a great target client profile. That's kind of lands back in that acceptable client profile. Most MSPs talk about, they have a city or 2 or 3, depending on how many offices they have, that they can better support clients that are within an X mile radius of that location, right? That's pretty typical. Don't go too crazy with it because windshield time is amongst the least efficient time that you've got. So be mindful of that. Criteria number 4 is vertical, right? Are they in a vertical that you can support? Oftentimes, MSPs that say they work with any vertical do have a few verticals that don't want to support, right? A lot of times they don't like, vertical A because they're jerks, vertical B because they don't like their software or whatever, right? There's a bunch of different reasons. I'm going to get more into verticalization here in a little bit. It kind of deserves its own topic, but know that having a vertical or two that you like or specifically don't like is important to have that listed in your target client profile as well. Criteria number 5 is attitude around technology, right? Their attitude around technology will tell you a lot of things. The first thing is, if they like and see technology as a way to enhance their business, that's probably a client you want to work with. If it's a client that says, I know I need computers, but I really hate them, is that a client you want to work with? Maybe it is. Maybe you find that you can turn those people around or that attitude doesn't bother you. But for some people, the attitude would be terribly off-putting. And I think it's important to know what works best for you and what you want to work with. Often their attitude around technology will impact how they feel about your company as well. So just know that those things kind of translate. The last criteria that I like to kind of lean into is their willingness to be stack compliant. I've mentioned already, and I'll mention it again later, is that this target client profile is how you set your service team up for efficiency success, right? Being efficient is really important. Your stack is really important to hitting your efficiencies. Not only is it your stack, but some of your processes and procedures. And so if you have a client that says, hey, I really want to jump in and get your stack in, and I want to get all these things lined up because we want to be a really good client of yours, heck yeah, you want to assign those guys. But on the flip side, if you have a client that comes in and says, I just kind of bought this firewall and I have a 2-year agreement, I really don't want to upgrade or I don't want to swap it out because I just paid for this thing. Is that okay? You can make a determination as to whether or not that's okay or not for you. But I'll tell you that every time you erode a piece of the stack away for whatever reason, your service team's less efficient. Their willingness to be stack compliant is important. Now, a number of MSPs will say, hey, as long as you get stack compliant within the first year, we're good, right? I actually don't mind that. A large part of this is road mapping them to being stack compliant. And as long as that's a reasonable time frame, I say go for it. But the reality is that if they are unwilling to be stack compliant for any particular reason, that might be a red flag for you. So just know that that's a thing. These are my 6 criteria that I like to lean into. There's a bunch of other ones you could pick. You could say, I don't want to be a client's first MSP, right? That's a thing I've heard before. Sometimes being that first MSP is kind of challenging because they aren't used to working with an MSP. They don't know what the processes are. They don't know why it's important or helpful. And so sometimes that's a problem, but sometimes people like that, right? There's a number of different ways to look at it, and I think that's perfectly fine, right? It's just know those kinds of things. One other criteria that I hear a lot is a no jerks policy. And that's seems like it's pretty straightforward, kind of permission to play kind of stuff, but I think it's important to be mindful of that, right? You don't want a client abusing your staff for any reason, right? Our jobs as MSPs are hard enough, and there are enough things that can go wrong in a day that you don't need someone piling on and being a jerk about it too. So you might want to have that. You at least want to consider it, or if you have a client that you can just kind of tell when you're meeting with them that they're just not friendly or their company culture is going to be a bad fit for you, that could be another criteria that you consider picking as well. So then the next question is, how do you figure out the benchmarks on the criteria that you should be using, right? This is how do I figure out which is the right levels of each of those criteria? Well, the biggest thing here is to take a look at your existing clients. Now, if you have 0 clients today, you're probably going to be willing to pick up most any client that's willing to pay you on a regular basis that is not a jerk, right? That your criteria is going to be a little bit different than if you have 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 or 100 clients. But if you have clients, I think it's important to take a look at your client base and say, you know what, if I had 100 of these people, I want to support them. If you could clone them over and over and over again, you have 100 more of them, I'm in. That's probably a pretty good idea about your target client profile. If you have that one client or a set of clients that you just know that these, if you could have more of these folks, I would use that as criteria, right? Take those as benchmarks, use those in your business, and that becomes your target client profile. So then the question becomes, what happens when you have a prospect that doesn't fit your target client profile? Well, this is where the term acceptable client profile comes into mix, as well as some ways of handling it. So the first thing is, I talk about the target client profile as that core part of the bullseye, right? That's an important piece. But the other thing is that might have an acceptable client profile that's a little bit bigger, right? Maybe it's out a ring or two on that dartboard. This acceptable client profile allows you to expand out the 5 to 10 machine swing to maybe 5 to 25 or something like that, right? The idea here is that if you have a client that is a little bit differently sized or that doesn't quite fit all of the different pieces, there are clients that that you can support well enough. And if you feel like you can support them for real and it's not a stretch every time you're turning around, it's probably fine. But if you're having to convince yourself that you need to sign this client every time or even more than half the time, that might be a problem. So just be mindful of that. A thing that comes up on a fairly regular basis is that the salesperson will say, hey, I got this referral and they're not a great fit, but I feel like we need to sign them anyway. Well, if they are outside your target client profile and outside your acceptable client profile, then you probably should be finding them a different MSP to work with. Because what happens if you sign a bad fit prospect that was a referral and you don't do a great job for them because it's going to be harder to do a great job for them, is that prospect will be frustrated, that brand new client becomes frustrated, then they're going to tell the person that referred them that this thing didn't go well. That person's going to be frustrated, and you're very likely going to shut off any new referrals coming from that source. This is where understanding and having some other MSPs in your market is important, right? Understanding who they are, who the players are, who a solid MSP that handles clients that are smaller than your target client profile and that are larger than your target client profile is valuable, right? If you know that you won't be able to do a good job servicing this referral, it is incumbent on you to not just take the referral because it was a referral. That is a bad reason to take on a new client. So make sure that you're doing things like fostering relationships with other MSPs. And if you hand off a referral to a different MSP, make sure you circle back to the person that referred you and say, hey, you know what? I really appreciate that referral. It means the world to me that you think that we would do a good job for them. Ultimately, they weren't a great fit for us, but I partnered them with another MSP, and that I think is going to be a better fit for them. Now, I would love it if you continue to send me referrals because that's great. This is kind of what my referral looks like. You could kind of coach them just a little bit. I think that could be a big benefit for you and the referring partner and the prospect that was referred to you. Because again, the last thing you want to do is sign a prospect that you know you can't support and then everyone's irritated about it. If you found value in this video so far, please go ahead and hit that like button. That really means a lot to me. Also throw a comment in there if you have other criteria or stories around target client profile in your business. So let's talk for a minute about business maturity and if there's a maturity mismatch. Sometimes what happens is you sign a prospect that is more or less mature than your business is. And oftentimes there's a standard deviation, right? So if your maturity level is here and they're a little bit a little better or a little worse maturity wise, not that big of a deal. But if your maturity level is here and they're way up here or way down here, that might be a problem for you in your business. So let's talk about that for a minute because I think it's important to consider what might happen here. So if your maturity level is here and they're way up here, right? They're a very mature organization. Oftentimes it's when they're a little bit larger, not always, but often. You're going to run into things like budgeting, where they have a budget cycle, and if you bring them things, projects, price increases, and those kind of things outside the budget cycle, they're going to be frustrated. A lot of times that they require you to be more communicative, right? Have better communication with their business around things like upgrades and reboots and maintenance and downtime and those kinds of things. And the third thing is that they oftentimes want to have a little bit more say and control about what happens in their organization. If you're not ready for that, if you're not able to support that and deal with that, then that becomes a problem for you. That's what happens when your maturity level's here and they're way up here. But now what happens when your maturity level's here and they're way down here, right? If they're a lower maturity company than you by a wide margin, you're going to be pulling them around quite a bit. This is things like stack compliance, right? They're not going to want to take your stack because maybe they don't have the money or budget to spend on the stack. Maybe they don't find the value in you as an MSP. Maybe they don't have the value in technology, or maybe their processes are such that they don't pay their bills on time, right? Those are all things that could have an issue. As you're building out your criteria, as you're understanding who a good client is for you, make sure that you honor the maturity level a little bit there. And it's as much about where you are versus where they are. Testing for maturity is one of those things that's a little bit harder. It's going to be more of a gut feel as you get a chance to talk to them and get to know them a little bit better. So just understand kind of where your maturity level is to a degree and kind of where they might be. And just understand that if there's a big mismatch, that might cause you some issues. So you've made it this far in the video. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Let's talk about verticalization quick before we get out of here. I'm a big fan of picking a vertical or two and really leaning into them. I think that there's a lot of benefits to you and benefits to the partners that you sign that are aligned with the vertical that you're good at. The first thing is that you understand their business. You understand how it works. You understand how they tick. Those are important pieces for when you go to meet with a prospect that's in a vertical that you already know, because you speak their language. You understand their common problems that they're running into. You understand the tools that they're using and those kinds of things. It just builds this level of almost instant credibility, especially when you're talking to them. I think those are really important things to lean into. The second part of verticals is that your team understands how to support them, understands their tools, understands the common issues, and they can routinely make their life better quickly because they already know how to support them, right? They're not having to learn a brand new industry every time you bring on a new client that happens to live in a vertical that you already know how to support. When it comes to marketing and prospecting to a vertical that you know how to support, this becomes a little bit easier too, because you can go to their industry events or places where you know that they're going to be and be able to have a target-rich environment to talk to a number of different companies in that vertical that you might be able to support. I think those are, again, we're talking about efficiency. Target client profile leads to efficiency. Well, efficiency doesn't just live in the service department, it also lives in your sales and marketing and prospecting areas as well. So if you can go to where there's lots of different people in that vertical that you already know how to support, I don't see what the downside is of that. Now, one quick word of caution when it comes to verticals is that there are a number of verticals that are a little bit more volatile than others, right? If you think back to the last couple economic downturns, right? You think back to 2008, you think back to COVID time frame, right? Things like hospitality had some issues, construction had some issues, oil and gas had some issues. Now, I'm not saying you need to avoid those altogether. What I'm saying is that you don't want to pick two highly volatile verticals. I think that becomes a challenge for your business, especially if something does happen in the economy that impacts their industry as a whole. If you're really good at hospitality, great. Lean into it, be really good at it, but maybe pick manufacturing or something else that's not as volatile when it comes to your second vertical, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at, is that you don't want to load up on verticals that move a lot with the swing of the economy. So it's one little warning about verticalization. One of the things that can also come from highly verticalizing is that you could become known as the MSP that is really good at this thing, this vertical, whatever the thing happens to be, and that can become part of your differentiator when it comes to selling into other companies that are adjacent in their vertical or adjacent to that vertical, right? Being known as the company that is great with this vertical can allow you to expand into other markets. It can allow you to highly focus your marketing and prospecting efforts. Lots of good things come from being verticalized. We've covered a lot today, so go out there, define your TCP, and get that sales engine rolling. Thanks for coming on this ramble with me, and I hope to see you on the next one.